Hello and welcome to this webinar organized with Tharawat Family Business Forum and NYU AD. My name is Farida Al-Agami. I'm the General Manager of the Tharawat Family Business Forum, and it's a great pleasure for us to welcome you to this session. To start off, a couple of pieces of information for you and for your viewing pleasure. So we would like to very much invite you to ask your questions. Please feel free to use the Q&A and the chat functions to do so. We would like to encourage you to do so. We know that many of you have a professional interest in this topic, so feel free to chime in and to share your opinions and your questions. If you're facing any issues with Zoom, please feel free to contact our team members. And of course, you can adjust your Zoom settings by using the top arrow on your Zoom screen. In order for you to see the context in which we hold this session, I would like to give you a little bit of information about this project. So the Family Business Histories Project was started 3 years ago and is a collaboration between the Tharawat Family Business Forum and NYU Abu Dhabi. Tharawat Family Business Forum is a nonprofit organization that focuses on the sustainability, innovation, and growth of family firms across the MENA. And of course, NYU, I don't think I have to introduce, but is of course a leading university, a global institution, learning institution. And we've been working together to form quite a unique project called Family Business Histories. Our purpose is really to compile, document, and analyze the history, legacy, and socioeconomic impact of family businesses, mainly in the GCC and MENASA region. We do that because, of course, as many of you know on this call, family businesses are the pillars of the private sectors. As we can see from these statistics across the world, this is a reality. So family firms are essential to any thriving and growing marketplace. And our goals with this project are 4 main pillars. Number 1, we want to understand the history, specifically the impact of family businesses on the regional economy across time. Our second pillar is to highlight the legacy. We are looking into individual family business histories, and we are looking to highlight that family's legacy and economic impact, basically from inside out in the region. We also are very, very adamant on preserving the heritage, especially in a region such as ours, which has a certain volatility, where sometimes the preservation of his heritage is under threat. We want to contribute to that and preserve that economic history as much as possible. And the last, but definitely not least or least important point, is to inspire the future. Our perspective here is that we will contribute to a better understanding of what legacy means and how next generations can deal with those legacies going forward. So just to give you an impression of some of the work that we have done so far, here are the 3 case studies that are currently available on our website. And we would like to invite you definitely to go and visit our website and download those case studies. We have Jashan Mal Group, UAE, India. We have Al Majdouai Group from KSA and NCR Rouiba in Algeria. And you will see how we've tried to approach our research in a very multidisciplinary and very engaged and personal way. So coming to today's topic, family businesses in historical perspectives, an interdisciplinary conversation. The reason for us to host this conversation is because we are really on the kind of intersection between the traditional, let's say, family business research space and historical research. And as a project, what we would like to do is to kind of bring together these 2 areas of expertise and see if we can build perhaps a new dimension of understanding family businesses in this context and going forward. So I'd like to invite our two speakers to come online, Professor Alfredo de Massis, who's a full professor of entrepreneurship and family business at the Free University of Bozen-Bolsano, IMD, and Lancaster University. Welcome, Alfredo.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning to everyone. Thanks for the nice invitation.
Thank you so much for being here. And of course, Professor Martin Klimke, who's Associate Professor of History, Vice Provost for Academic Policies and Governance at New York University in Abu Dhabi. Welcome, Martin.
Thank you for having me.
And as you can see from Martin's backdrop, he's also, of course, the cornerstone of our project together with Tharawat. And so obviously it's even more of a pleasure to have him here. So before diving into the conversation, we just wanted to celebrate Professor Alfredo's birthday. So happy birthday, Alfredo.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Feeling blessed. Thanks.
So we're very, very proud that on your birthday, you said yes to being here with us and to celebrating this with a conversation about family business and history. So all the best.
It's really an honor to be celebrating my birthday, by discussing with you on such important and interesting topics. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right, so let's dive in. I wanted to kick off perhaps by giving Alfredo the floor for a couple of minutes to set the scene with regards to the family business research field. Alfredo, maybe you can take us through how this field has come about, what has happened in its development, and where perhaps we stand today.
Okay, thank you very much, Farida. Thank you to Tharawat Family Business Forum, and of course also to NYU Abu Dhabi for this invitation. Yeah, I mean, as we wrote in a recent editorial published in Family Business Review, titled "The Adulthood of Family Business Research Through Inbound and Outbound Theorizing," which I will be happy also to share with the attendees in case it's of interest. What we basically say is that, of course, the family business research field has been developing quite a lot over the last decades, and has reached what we call its adulthood. So to some extent, from a very initial stage where the legitimacy of the field was not very much established, a consistent and important body of knowledge has been produced in a second stage, and now we are in this adulthood stage where we are trying to speak more with other fields. And what we basically say is that such development has been possible, on the one hand, through what we call inbound theorizing. Inbound theorizing refers to exchange that bring in theories and on literatures and on knowledge from other disciplines, from other fields, to support, to enrich, and to provide different perspective on family firms. So these were studies that picked up theories, from economics, from family science, from psychology, from different fields, and applied to family firms. Besides that, there was what we call outbound theorizing, and outbound theorizing is instead about, exchange that draw on the uniqueness of family firms to challenge, to question the boundary conditions of broader theories. So for instance, all the studies that have shown that when you consider a family firm, you cannot simply consider, if you want to really understand their decisions, you cannot simply consider only the financial and economic goals. You need to take into account also the family-centered non-economic ones. And this is somehow a way of challenging some of other, theories outside the family business field that were based on that. So
I think we've lost him. Alfredo, can you hear us? Okay. Well, I think, Martin, maybe we can pick up on that until Alfredo comes back. I think he made a couple of really interesting points already with regards to, the inbound and the outbound research aspects. Maybe we can jump to the first question that I had for you then. How do historians, or how have historians looked at family firms? And if so, how did that happen, and in what context did that happen?
Right. So basically, I think what I would start by saying is that history as itself, historiography as an established discipline, obviously has a long history in and of itself, and is extremely diversified. So there are many, many fields and areas, where we can see history branching into such an area that would connect to family business history. So in that sense, I think what Alfredo was saying in terms of the cross-fertilization, between individual disciplines is extremely important. Since he's back, I think I'm going to hand it over.
Are you back?
Okay. No, he's not back. He's not
Still not back.
I can talk about it a little bit more.
Yeah, please.
But I think the idea really is here that we think of history, as a large framework with many subdisciplines. And economic history is certainly, a very strong one, a very powerful one. Social history, cultural history, and within economic history, of course, family business research and history in particular has developed, over the centuries, over time, as part of these subdisciplines. Now, I think, as Alfredo was saying, there is obviously the compartmentalization of academia that doesn't allow, sometimes these conversations that are so incredibly useful to have these flow of theories that he was talking about, easily, take hold. So I think the goal really in the last 20 years is to not only establish family business history research, as a legitimate subdiscipline, in historiography itself, but also to make sure that there is this exchange, between family business research proper. So in other words, bridging the fields of economics, of history, of management studies, organizational studies, in a way that is useful. Now, I think if you want to sort of zoom back, I think this often quoted sentence by Adam Smith is very helpful when he was saying that economic life is deeply embedded in social life, and it cannot be, understood as separate, from anything that happens in society, from the customs, morals, and habits in which society occurs. So in other words, economic life, cannot be divorced from culture. And I think this is what Alfredo was starting to talk about, that this doesn't happen in a vacuum. Family businesses do not operate in the vacuum. There are individuals involved, that they have a history, that these are particular areas that are connected. And the field of economics in recent years had opened itself up to many of these approaches, from other fields such as psychology, sociology, and anthropology, to really talk about the other factors that impact economic transactions, short of any sort of rational choice or individual profit, models. So in other words, there's a greater, if you like, cultural turn that has happened, in many of these disciplines. And I think this is where we're connecting to Alfredo again.
Wonderful. Well, you've missed a great introduction by Martin, Alfredo. I'm sorry to say.
I'm sorry, the technical issues are always around the corner.
No problem, no problem. But you were just telling us a little bit about, so Martin has just summarized, perhaps very roughly, and we can come back to that, I think, Martin, to follow up on what Alfredo said about like the historian's perspective of, the family firm and how economic and social activity has always obviously been one. You cannot disassociate those things. And I think that links again back to what you were just saying about how the family business research field has developed. So maybe you want to pick back up on that point.
Okay, thank you, and sorry. Yeah, I mean, what I was saying is that, so there has been an important development, and this development has been based on some kind of connection and exchange of knowledge and ideas with other fields. But yet, when we reflect on what has been produced so far, what we can say is that if on the one hand, we know, for instance, that family firms behave in a different way as compared to the non-family counterparts, at the same time, we know that, family firms are kind of heterogeneous, and there are several possible reasons for such heterogeneity. So we know that the small, bakery shop is completely different from a family multinational companies, etc. But yet, what I can say is that there are still so many unaddressed fundamental questions. So still these days, for instance, we don't know how the historical context, how the past, how the tradition of a company, of a family firm can inform its different behaviors, can inform the way they define their strategies, the way they, for instance, innovate. We know that sometimes family firms are a type of business organization that are very much stigmatized as being, reluctant to innovate, because the past is very present, because the tradition is so much important. And actually, I think this is one of the value of the positive things about family firms. And still, we don't have a clear body of knowledge regarding how all these resources pertaining to the past, like their history, the way such history is told, is narrated within the family firm context, how all this can be used to, for instance, to innovate, but even for, handling generational transitions in order to, managing conflicts and mitigating such kind of conflicts. Things like this. Also, I also believe that, we have in many countries around the world, in many geographies, so many examples of family firms that are really multi-generational. So they have been surviving for so long, and many of them have been going through very tough time over the years. This current crisis, or the social and economic reverberation of this pandemic, is challenging our companies, but this is not the only type of crisis that businesses have been. And so I think there is also a lot to learn in order to understand how the way a family firm in the past has been going through a crisis, have been going through a difficult period, can help the organization to learn how to absorb and react to such kind of shocks. So for instance, the resilient. There are studies, including by myself, that I proved with data from all over the world, actually, that family firms tend to be more resilient than non-family firms when the times get tough. Yet, I believe that we don't have a clear understanding of how a company and its territory and its actors, of course, have been living in the past, can shape, the way they learn and the way they do that in the future. So I definitely believe that the field of history, broadly considered, and business history, in particular, will be two important fields where family business scholars and family business researchers will have, that we'll have to look at with very much attention, because there is a lot to learn, but also a lot to give back, especially because this is, if you consider the many possible different types of organizations, the family firm is for sure the ideal one, where the history is not only respected, but is definitely present and handed over from one generation to the next, by definition.
I think that's a key point, Alfredo. Sorry to just jump in, because I think there's a very practical angle to all of this, and I think what would be great in our conversation is to also look at the concrete impact of what we are talking about here. And one such example I'd like to share, which in preparation for this webinar, we actually received an email from a family business member who said, we are in second generation, we have to prepare the third generation for succession, and history is a difficult topic for us to address. Now, obviously, I don't know exactly the context of this comment, but this is not the first time that I have heard about this conflict, because very often we hear this problem of, we don't talk about the sociocultural political history that happened around us, and we are even more avoiding the topic of what happened to our family. And another example that I'd like to give is that a next gen once told me in a private conversation, I feel I've inherited a heavy backpack. It feels like it's full of stones or bricks. I know I will have to carry it around with me all my life, but I'm not allowed to look inside. So this is kind of the emotional impact, I would say, of this kind of academic topic that we are talking about today, right? So it has these two dimensions, which I think is very, very important. And yeah, please, Alfredo.
Yeah, I mean, just to add on this, what is important is that in a family firm, if you consider different family members, they typically are characterized by different temporal orientations. So some of them are more oriented toward history, toward the past, others are more oriented toward the future. And as you correctly said, this creates sometimes the fertile ground for tensions to arise. As you said, from the quote that from the example that you reported from this family company, understand that history is actually a difficult topic, because when you talk about history, you are basically talking about something that was happening, in the past, or that is at least temporally distant. And when you talk about that in such a very heterogeneous, group of family members, where some of them are for natural reasons instead oriented toward the future, think about the next generation. Of course, this creates some issues, and so I've been living through these issues. On the one hand, the moral obligation to respect what was pertaining to the past, while at the same time, also, your for demographic reason, your propensity to instead look at the future and things like this. And so this is very, very important, and it's something that needs to be, I think, needs to be addressed. This should not be a taboo topic, definitely. Talking about history in the family business context, I think it's definitely beneficial. And what will be a big challenge from a practice standpoint, if we think, for instance, at the next generation of millennials, right, that are there, at the point of almost taking over the reins of their businesses, I think it will be very important to let them understand that the past must not necessarily be seen as a liability as compared to the future. These are not necessarily two things that are going against each other. Actually, there are some examples, and I have examples, of companies that I know well, like, the Berettas, like Marinelli in Italy, that are at the same time very much anchored to their history, but also very much, oriented toward the future and toward exploring and exploiting opportunities that are, arising from innovation and things like this.
Absolutely. No, thank you I think that really pointed out the complexity of the matter that we're talking about today. Martin, I'd love to have your reaction from a historian's perspective, because of course the expectation of a historian, of an academic historian, looking at economic behavior, at commercial behavior of certain entities, has a more top-down approach rather than a bottom-up approach. And I'd love for you to perhaps explain to us a little bit what your perspective is on this matter, on how the historian's view is of the family firm and of all those questions that we just discussed.
So it's interesting because it's also personal for me on a variety of levels, because I'm not a trained economic historian. So I came to this topic, because I was interested, and I'm trained, as a diplomatic, political, and cultural historian. And I think for me, that has always been, the alluring part, that we can look at specific ideas, that are developed in a certain context that might be economic in nature predominantly, through a whole different lens. So from my perspective, I've always seen economic history as at least partially cultural and political history, and have seen this sort of temporal dimension that Alfredo was talking about as a continuum, as not something that is, broken up and neatly packaged and can be sort of resuscitated in any way, shape, or form for specific lessons. And I think, people much more knowledgeable than I am have written about, this sort of intricate relationship, between history, historiography, and economics, as well as individual family business history. So for example, people like Hartmut Berkhoff, an economic historian based in Germany, have written about this sort of region why companies, very pragmatically, and this cuts to your question, should deal with history, because number one, it provides an orientation for them, their positionality, in this continuum. Number two, it provides a sense of identity. It is motivational. It is something that can be projected in their communication to create a specific image, of that particular company that has a commercial, validity as well. Number three, I think, and this is, cutting to that question, learning from the past. And, as we talked about before this webinar, obviously every historian is very allergic to this idea, of a straightforward lesson from the past, because the contextual factors change so rapidly, and the contingency that is built in historical development forbids it, for us to simply make simple equations from one historical context to the other. Now, at the same time, however, learning from the past happens, because we build a critical understanding of larger trends, larger trajectories in history, larger developments, and our position in those developments. And that is why I think every generation, whether it's a family business or society at large, has to write and rewrite the history books anew, because there are new questions, new challenges, new obstacles in their way. And that's why I feel, that is intrinsic value, for family businesses to engage with history. And obviously for historians, broadly speaking, there's a similar, incentive to overcome the siloing in the academy and have a critical dialogue, with economists, with family business researchers and scholars in that area, to see how these particular fields intersect. And that is really important. And I think historians by default at large, I would say, and then I'm counting myself among them, have neglected, family businesses as ecosystems, as building blocks, as larger vehicles of societal, cultural, and political trends. And that particular interconnectedness, I think, is what's so important. And, this is very abstract. If you look at our case studies, it's very clear. They don't happen in a vacuum, whether it's Algeria, whether it's the UAE, whether it's India, context matters, and the ways in which these individuals build their businesses was heavily dependent on their experiences, their perceptions, their educational context. And that is why we see the impact of history on family businesses at large as a prism through which we view regional histories.
Yes, I totally agree. If I can add, the chrono context matters a lot in to understand the decisions, the behaviors, and also the performance of actors, groups, and organizations. Another important point that probably it's worth mentioning is that the family business research so far has been focusing especially on the operational companies, right? So on companies, producing something, right? Whereas if we bring in, and I'm working and I'm talking with many families, when you consider an entrepreneurial family, an enterprising families, besides the operational businesses, there are lots of other entities like foundations, like, family firm museums, family firms archives. I've been working, for instance, on a research project with Aboca, which is a company in the pharmaceutical industry producing natural drugs. And they have, an historical museum called Biblioteca Antiqua, an historical library, and also an historical database. And they use all this history, to inform many of the things that they do at this company. Or if I'm talking, in Italy, for instance, if you consider companies like Pirelli, Prada, Feltrinelli, these are all companies who have established the family business foundations. I mean, what I'm saying is that I think that scholars and researchers should also start to study more and more these other type of entities that I call boundary organizations, because are organizations that are, certainly, in the world of things owned by an entrepreneurial families, are not necessarily pertaining to a specific business, but can play a very important role because, for instance, the foundations are the means through which often families socially construct, legitimacy around something, maybe through art, maybe through philanthropy, maybe through different sort of activities. I'm doing a research actually with an enterprising families, where what we are discovering is that establishing the family foundation was a way for the current and old leader to create some kind of immortality for him. And we have also some, real examples of iconic companies. Think about the Olivetti. The Olivetti was a company that is renowned, I would say, all over the world. They were very, they were very, very famous because they produced the typesetting machines and all these kind of things. Now the operational business are not there anymore, but there is still the foundation, still owned, and controlled and managed by the family. And if you talk with them, there is a lot about, history, when you are trying to understand the reason why that kept this alive. There is also lots in terms of aesthetic knowledge, because this was a company where aesthetic and beauty was always, something that was inspiring the behaviors of individuals. And what I'm trying to say is that, if we really want to understand how history can be leveraged and how history can play an important role in shaping the behavior of family enterprises, we need to also focus our attention on this kind of boundary organizations, because this type of organizations are those that oftentimes are really created to portray or to portray some sort of historically related ambition or goal. And unfortunately, there is not much research done on that, because most of the family business scholars have been studying instead the businesses, just the operational businesses. So this is, I think, an open call to work more and to understand more these kind of entities that are in the cloud of all the possible things that families own, because sometimes these are the actual means through which families try to construct, try to sometimes even to build up their values and their history, because let's not forget that history can also be socially constructed through rhetorical efforts. And especially now, I think, many family firms in many regions around the world are struggling with some kind of, with the risk of losing somehow their identity in the face of a very quickly changing world that, makes it more and more difficult sometimes to keep alive the memory. So how to prevent a family firm from forgetting some important things about the past? How to make sure that historical things can be really internalized, by which I mean can be really brought close to everyone within the organization. Ideally, not only to the family members, but even to the non-family ones, to every kind of employee within the organization. This is a challenge. Thankfully, there are some practices that can be put in place and that can, help some family firms to make to keep history alive.
Well, thank you so much, Alfredo. I would like to encourage, by the way, our audience, because I know there's a lot of people on here who have either done research on this or family firms who are on the call who perhaps have a personal experience as well that you would like to share. So feel free to use the chat or the Q&A button. I'll come to the first question in a little moment, which actually is the second question after the happy birthday to you, Alfredo. But I would like to perhaps drill down even further. So we've spoken about kind of the macro view, which would be kind of the historical perspective of kind of human behavior. Then we deep dive into the individual unit, which is the individual family business. But doesn't it all really merge when we look at the individual? Because all of this is, of course, shaping identities. And I think ultimately what we've realized, and I'd love for you, Martin, to comment on this a little bit through our project perhaps, is shaping a personal individual identity that influences our behavior, that influences our leadership, that influences how we behave on a day-to-day basis, how we behave with our teams, with our family members. That obviously is greatly linked to the legacy of our individual family, but also of the larger context that we come from. So maybe, Martin, you can comment on that, maybe some takeaways from our project, but also from a historian's perspective, how you would qualify that, and how, a better historical understanding could influence our leadership capacity, if any. I mean, this is a question to speculate, of course, or to debate. But I'd love to have your perspective on that.
I'm still digesting and processing that this sort of initial question about the uncomfortableness of talking about history in a family context. And I do think that that's certainly at the core, of many of these things. How do we start talking about things that we know are potentially problematic? Questions of responsibility, questions of guilt, individual or collectively. How do we start having these conversations, with an eye towards gaining historical and awareness and knowledge? And I think that's hard, and it really depends, on many factors here. And obviously there's a great deal of literature, to be looked at about the ways in which, the economic sector or businesses in general, were in any way, shape or form connected, to developments in society that were problematic, in previous political contexts, in war, in civil war. So that is something that I think is hard for a variety of reasons. Nonetheless, I think, there's a reason why we do historiography, and that is to get an awareness and a critical sort of understanding of things in the past so that we don't fall prey to narratives, and this is where we come back to Alfredo's point, the rhetorical history, to narratives that might not be overlapping or connected to historical reality. So I give you an example. One of the family business histories that we just talked about was about trying to innovate specific principles, in production processes that were seen as sacrosanct, from the founders period. So that particular individual had to argue against, the way things have always been done. And that is hard, obviously, because, with the founder, obviously you have a whole mythological dimension to it that is a very strong part of the legacy, and there's gratitude, there's all these kind of, psychological dynamics that are in play. So I do feel, having a thorough understanding about the historical context, in which the founder, set up a company, or how a company emerged, or weathered crisis and mastered challenges, or did not master challenges. I think one of the things that I like so much about Alfredo's intervention about, sort of the context is that, an enormously fruitful area of research is obviously failed businesses and why they failed, and, how they failed, and how these particular businesses are not operating, for a variety of reasons. And what does it tell us about, the macro and the micro dimension? So I think, to answer your question, I feel very strongly that I think the individual is at the center, of societal, cultural, and political dimensions, and trying to figure out, the reality that individual people in the past experienced gives us a better idea of how their ideas at the time, came about, which context they emerged in, and how they then were transformed into action or not. And this is where I like, Alfredo's point about the performance. The performance doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's determined by a variety of factors. And yes, obviously market principles still apply. And, how much more we talk about the cultural context and political context, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we are still talking about economic principles here. So they still stand at the core of that. But I do think understanding thoroughly how they're embedded into these larger fields and larger tensions is very important. And once you have these conversations, I think you illuminate, the larger trajectory that the family business that you're talking about is on, and how it, developed over time.
And I promise I'll get to the two questions in a moment, but I'd like to kind of perhaps close this loop with regards to why it is so hard. And the tension that we have seen in our research, Alfredo, is that there is kind of also a misunderstanding between understanding and being open to our own history, our family's history, our business history, versus the reputational aspect. So there is this fear, and we've had this fantastic conversation with the director of the German Institute for Business History, who really gave us really good examples of this. Because obviously in Germany, because you have this obligation of being open about what happened, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s with your company, it kind of merges. However, for many other companies, there is this fear that the moment you start digging a little bit and you start being honest with your family members, that it would tarnish the reputation, or it might potentially tarnish the reputation of your firm. So maybe you could speak a little bit to that, Alfredo, with regard to
yes,
identity versus reputation.
Definitely. I mean, this is a very important topic First of all, there is an important bias when you talk about history, with individuals, which is that they tend to recall what is positive, and they tend to, hide or forget what is not so positive, what's not so positive. So, from a researcher perspective, because of the reputation thing, since they want to try to maximize as much as possible their reputation, they were less inclined to recall maybe happenings that happened in the past that were not so positive. And we cannot, we cannot hide that any family had, some non-positive things. There is no family that only have been living and going through positive ones. So there is, as you said, between reputation and identity, some sort of trade-off, which I also tend to see quite close to the authenticity of the family firm. I mean, being authentic means to me being consistent to the values of the past that you have had, and means behaving also when you speak and when you make things consistently with such values. And I know that authenticity is currently one of the of the hot topics on the agenda of some family firms, because many of them, especially with the generational transitions, have been losing somehow that authenticity, which is bad also from a market perspective, because there are studies that show that when you are able to really reveal yourself as authentic, typically consumers typically the market appreciates that. There is a value attached to that. One other important point that I think is another limitation of existing research is also lying in the unit of analysis. Too often when we study family firms, we use the firm as our unit of analysis, or sometimes maybe the individual, but typically we use the firm, right? And we try to understand something, some behavior, some phenomenon using the firm. Now there is actually a lack of studies that use instead the dynasty. I'm actually doing a research where I'm re-examining some very highly studied, phenomena like succession. But when I study this, I use the dynasty. A dynasty is a succession of people from the same family who play a prominent role in a business. And, if you use the dynasty, the way you see things is different, right? If you have this dynastic perspective. And unfortunately, this is something missing, because when we look, for instance, at the single business, of course, the single business looks at succession, for instance, in some specific way, where we have two generations at this time, and they try to understand how to possibly, have a smooth process, etc. But if you look at the dynasty, that changes completely the way you see this. So what I'm trying to say is that even in the research arena, in the research community, there is a huge need to reconsider the unit of analysis and the level of analysis at which we conduct our studies. And of course, if you want to study something using the dynasty as a unit of analysis, you cannot, but you have to really use history and historical research methods. Indeed, there are, in my view, two main ways through which history can be beneficial for research and for better understanding, therefore, the behavior of people and organizations. One is history to theory, and the second is history in theory. The former means, drawing more on historical research methods and historical database and all those things where historians are very good in order, to collect and analyze data to theorize around the phenomenon. But history in theory means instead bringing in history in the theories, which means, really considering history as a key variable for your theorizing. And again, when you consider the context, too often, if not always, the context by family business researchers have been considered at best as a control variable when they consider, for instance, but, there has not been any important efforts in really trying to move it to the front seat of theories of theorizing, to really try, and this, implies a disruptive change in the research designs, in the designs of the studies,
Absolutely.
which I think is something that is very much needed, which is also why I believe that the initiatives that you have put together around family business histories is not only timeless, because histories will continue to play an important role, but also very timely.
Thank you. And I'd love to hear more about the FBR special issue, maybe in our next, towards the end of the conversation, because I think it
With
really
pleasure.
also will answer a lot of the questions that have been asked about why now, why is this happening now? Why is the historical aspect coming up now?
Yes.
I'd love for you, Martin, perhaps if you wanted to comment on what Alfredo just has said, but also perhaps to dive in a second part into this one question that has just been shared about how can I collect my family's history and share it with family members, and maybe draw a little bit upon our experience. And I'm sure also Alfredo has some thoughts on this.
So absolutely, with pleasure. I mean, I think I completely second what Alfredo said. I think this is about an interdisciplinary dialogue. It is about, not essentially saying that there hasn't been any history, in family business research, or that historians have ignored family businesses as a unit of history. This is about, cross-fertilization, learning from each other, and bringing, the relative, methodological, questions and tools essentially together to bear fruition. I think it is intrinsically about the research question. What is the question that I want to have answered, in my particular research, and how do I go about it, and how do I do that in a larger context? Faria, you said something very interestingly earlier in our conversation about the top-down nature of economic history versus, the microcosm. Well, yes, but that's obviously only one part of the story. I mean, obviously historians, have looked at grassroots, ways in which, to look at the economic sphere in the area of labor history, for example. So there are many ways, I think, to approach the same phenomenon from a variety of questions. So the same topic, will take on very different dimensions, depending on your angle. And I think this is what this conversation is about. I think there's many ways to sort of think about, the topic at hand, depending on the questions that you're trying to ask. I might want to engage in my family business history because I want to know specifically how that particular family business dealt with historical challenges, at a specific time. Or I have a very sort of clear understanding, about that already. And I want to make sure that the image that I've had, for this particular family business or certain products is actually, justified and has that particular root. So I think the motivational aspect here is key, whether I'm going to do that because I want to gain historical knowledge intrinsically, or whether I have sort of other interests, marketing, communication, image cultivation, all of these things. I think that's key. And how to go about it, is hard. It's messy because, as Alfredo so nicely said, we're dealing with human beings and they're inherently biased about their own, narratives that they construct themselves when looking at the past. So one of the things that we've done, obviously, in our research here is to make sure to explain to all the families that we've worked with that this is a sort of comprehensive, a holistic approach, that oral history, is one toolkit that we're using to extricate, perceptions of the past, but that documents, historical databases, the context, is forming a larger picture. And there can be tensions. And there often are tensions between individual people's recollections, of specific events over time. Our memory works, in mysterious ways sometimes, but it's actually not so mysterious, because there are certain ways in which we know now our brain functions in terms of memory that is following specific patterns and that is following specific narratives. So it's only natural that you look at, and that's kind of what you learn when you study history in the first semester, at every single piece of information and source critically. You don't take it at face value. So I think in order to sort of start your journey to explore your own family business history is data collection. It's extremely important, to get as many data points as possible, whether it be through individuals, whether it be through any kind of source material, archives that certain individual companies still have are always a good source for that. But that's really where it starts, and it certainly doesn't end there, because one of the key goals of our project is not just to create the data and then be done with it, but use the data then to contextualize and to ask larger questions. And I think one of the famous historians has said that you want to do in history, you want to find the general in the specific. So in other words, you want to find in every case study what larger societies, powers and pushes and factors imprint on the individual, the specificity, and extrapolating these two forces, how is an individual going through history and how is history essentially forming that particular individual? That's really the key challenge. And that's exciting, that's adventurous. It can be sad and difficult at times, but it's certainly leaving you with a more holistic picture about not only the past, but also your position in this continuum that is called history.
Thank you so much. We have a couple of more questions that in the next kind of 5 minutes, I'd love to perhaps touch upon. It's going to be difficult because they're really, really interesting, but we'll try to at least give a little bit of an insight. So perhaps, Alfredo, following up on what Martin just said with regards to the collection of data and how to approach this as an individual, there's a question here about families desiring to set up centers or museums. When is it a good time to do that? And why would it be important for a family to do so, perhaps?
Well, I would say the good timing is once you have some history. So you must be having, some kind of history accumulated over the years, of course. So probably, I would say that the higher the generation, the number of generation in control. So if you are a multi-generational family firm, then probably it might be worth. The reasons, I think, are different and are, as it happened many times when you consider family firm behavior, both economic and non-economic. Because I think that can be also important from a strategic viewpoint, so also from, I would say, a strictly economic point of view, to set up a foundation or a museum. For instance, ABOC, as I said, is a company that uses these things, but also, some historical artifacts as a way to, to gain a competitive advantage over competitors, because they're really good at embedding such history in the end, also in the products that they make. And so when someone buys that, they buy the history of the, of the whole territory where they operate. Besides that, we know that families, if we consider the family system, have these other types of goals that are more, family-centered, and with the push-ons leads to the accumulation of social-emotional wealth, where, working on that can be a very good way on a foundation or in a museum can be a very good way to perpetuate some sort of goals that are instead more centered around the family. Sometimes for many family businesses, establishing a foundation can also be a way to handling the succession process, because let's not forget that when we manage a succession process, besides the entry of the new generation, we have also to think about the exit of the former one. We cannot just assume that the former generation will be disappearing, after the succession. So, sometimes the foundation can be a way to give to those people who are, better custodians of the previous history, a proper space where they can play around and also, advance their family centered agenda. So I would say that in general, there are theories again showing that being able to leverage on the history, on the past, has a positive effect. From a strategy viewpoint, you know that value in strategy, when you look at value in strategy, you look typically at two things: value creation and value capture. Value creation, and I think that, there are theoretical perspectives that explain why, if you are able to embed, for instance, your history into your products or services, you can gain advantages in terms of both value creation and value capture. Value creation, because, it's, we cannot deny that any individual, I mean, all of us look at the golden age of the past with very, very positive highs, with very positive, in a very positive way. And so if we are able to draw, to leverage on the history, and I'm thinking a bunch of Italian firms that I know quite well, like, you know, let me think about the Missoni families, another big family. They produce amazing sweaters, you know, in the fashion industry. If you think about their products where the history is clearly present, is there. When you look at one of their sweaters, you see the history of that family. That's an advantage because there are also studies showing that being able to draw on history in that way reduces the, increases the reliability of an innovation brought to the market, for instance, is typically, you know, seen positively by the customers, etc. But also if you think in terms of value capture, there are advantages because history is by definition idiosyncratic of your own family and or of your own company. So if you are able to really, you know, use it and draw on it to do what you do, to create your products or services or whatever, it will be more difficult for competitors to imitate. So I think there are some, let's call scientific reasons to believe that history can be a very important role. And I think that more and more family business owners, family business leaders could start thinking about history as they think about any other resource, you know, human resources, financial resources, social capitals, or relational resources. Well, there is a resource that is, you know, mainly related to the heritage, to the tradition, to the past, and again, can be a resource. So my call is to, rather than being scared about the history, trying to instead see it in a positive way, not only to better understand your own identity, but also to better think how you can, what you can make out of it. So how you can leverage it to gain some kind of competitive advantage.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's exactly how I feel this tension perhaps between internal, the kind of the identity and the reputational side, you know, might be overcome a little bit. There's one question that we won't be able to answer because it's quite complex and quite rich about kind of the complexity of family business history and how it has developed. But I think for the person who has asked the question, one thing I can recommend is to read the study done by Hartmut Berghoff, comparing the German and US family firms across from the first industrial revolution. It's a beautiful study that I'm sure in our email we can attach because it's really extremely well executed, and I feel it gives you that broader trend that you might be looking for with regards to your question. The last question, Martin, a very practical one, and we have 3 minutes left, but I think it's an important one, is now how do I keep this? And again, it comes back to this tension, right? Identity versus reputation. If I want to get started in a very simple way with my family, how do I make sure I can preserve the integrity of the information that I might find and control what we do with that information? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Martin.
Right. I mean, I think as I see in the Q&A box, there are lots of questions about the legal ramifications and all of these things, and these are only natural. I mean, I think this is what the historians have to deal with, that you always have an incomplete set of information or data points of the past, and then you essentially use that particular source material to extrapolate and interpret and construct, you know, that particular narrative based on your question. So I think the key point is to be very clear about your research question. Why are you doing this? What is your goal? And, you know, to be mindful of individuals' feelings, their sort of life accomplishments, and their particular willingness to engage with you to be part of that particular journey. Because there's also, you know, a lot of trust building that is absolutely indispensable before reaching out and having these conversations, because we're talking about people's lives, we're talking about, you know, their experience, and they clearly have an interest, you know, in protecting that, and there might be, other sort of commercial or legal or economic interests involved.
Mm-hmm.
But I would think, and we should probably do another sort of webinar just on that, how to approach that, from a specific, almost technical toolkit perspective. What do I do? How do I preserve material that I find there? How do I preserve and digitize documents? How do I digitize, old tapes or ledgers, all these kinds of things. I think data science and library science, have made huge advances in finding the ways in which to preserve material, beyond the usual changes that we see in technology, so that future generations have something to preserve. So the most common motivation is precisely that, passing on your legacy, capturing the historical moment for future generations, to essentially point to, whether it is almost exclusively positive or whether it also has, a more complicated trajectory. That is, in that sense, not the key motivational factor. It is really finding your individual identity as part of a larger societal or family history that is manifesting themselves in these generational successions.
So sadly, we are coming to the end of our session. I just wanted to share one last thing, other than your birthday again, Alfredo. We are very, very proud that we've just launched a new version of our website of this project. So I'd like to invite everybody to go and view it. There are case studies. We're explaining the approach of our project. And we'd like to invite everyone who's been so kind to spend time with us today, to give us feedback and to engage with us, because we really think, like Alfredo said, and like Martin also emphasized, this is an interdisciplinary conversation that we need to have in the interest of family firms across the region. I'd like to close with a thank you note. I would like to give you just the floor, Alfredo, very quickly to mention the special issue, because I think it would be really interesting for our audience, and then any closing words that you might have for us.
Yes, thank you very much. We have this ongoing special issue at Family Business Review. The deadline for submission of articles is actually July 1st. So it's approaching fast. And the basic idea behind this is that we are calling for new interdisciplinary research on family firms that can extend our understanding of how and why history and historical research methods can enrich theoretical but also practice explanations of family firm behaviors. So we are really looking forward to receiving contributions that can be conceptual, can be empirical, can be qualitative, like case studies, or can be quantitative. The important thing is that we want scholars from different disciplines, ideally, authorship team that are really multidisciplinary, who submit their works, their studies, aim to understand how history and or historical research methods can be applied to improve our current knowledge. So if there is anyone here in this audience who might be working in this area and has any contribution that want to send, feel free to submit and or to approach me if you are looking forward for any questions or whatever.
We will definitely send the link. We will definitely send the link to your call for papers for sure. Martin, any closing words?
No, I'm just very, very thankful for Alfredo to be with us today on his birthday, and I'm in awe and very inspired, obviously, as we all are, by his works, and I'm very much looking forward, to that particular special issue and a continued dialogue, about family businesses as a whole, whichever discipline we are from.
Absolutely. So on behalf of the entire team, Alfredo, thank you so much. And also thanks to our audience who've been very patient, who've been sticking with us through this lunchtime hour. And of course, Alfredo, we hope, as usual, to see you back very soon again.